Julia, thank you for the kind introduction. It is great to see some familiar faces. Wonderful to have this time with those of you I haven't met yet, and look forward to talking all about GOTV. I'm going to share my screen so that we can get started. All right, everyone seeing a PowerPoint? Can I get some thumbs up? Amazing. All right, well, I am here to talk to you today about GOTV. And I did the math this morning, which will date me quite a bit. But as I was thinking about this training and thinking about my own GOTV experiences, I realized that I have been through and or led a whopping 13 GOTV programs, which both makes me very tired and feel a little old. So I'm excited to hopefully impart some lessons that I've learned and save you some of the mistakes that I have made along the way. So I will start with an introduction of who I am, and I apologize. Let's get into present mode here. Okay, so Abby Witt, I use she, her pronouns. I am a partner at Arena where I focus on our electoral programming and careers programming. So obviously today will be more focused on elections, but happy to talk about jobs as well. I like to say that I got tricked in organizing in 2004. If you had told me that organizing in part was like going up to random people and having intense political conversations with them, there is no way on earth I would have done it. But I had good friends in college who had better heads on their shoulders than I did, and got dragged along for a day of canvassing and absolutely fell in love with it. So I have been working as an organizer and a manager of people and campaigns ever since then. I'm based in Chicago. I am a proud Chicagoan. I don't know that we have many people who have that in common on the call this morning, but that's where I'm coming to you from, and excited to dive in. We have a couple goals this session. The first is really to internalize the purpose and goals that drive every decision around GOTV. GOTV comes at the obviously end of a campaign. Whether it's electoral, whether it's a ballot initiative, you guys have been running and running and running and running. And now at the end of the marathon, GOTV is the sprint, which is really hard. So understanding the purpose and goals and sort of recentering the why you are making these decisions and running a smooth GOTV program is one of the goals for this morning. The second is really to understand the components of a GOTV plan. One of my very favorite sayings, Julia has heard this ad nauseum, but is to plan the work and work the plan. Your work gets easier with a plan. Again, this is a sprint at the end of the marathon. People are tired, they are distracted. You need something that is going to help deliver clear communication and set clear expectations for your team. So understanding the components of what goes into a good GOTV plan is a very big part of what we're going to do this morning. Goal number 3, this is no surprise. Even the best GOTV plans from 2019 will not work this time around. And so we're going to talk about sort of the traditional components of a GOTV plan and then how you can recognize opportunities to adapt those plans to the circumstances you find yourself in. At Arena, we work in a bunch of different states. We have 5 priority states for the cycle. And I will tell you, even among those 5 states, people are handling COVID and the circumstances around COVID very differently. Some people are canvassing, some people are not. And so you all, Julia said, this is not something that's going to be prescriptive for your unique circumstance, but we're going to recognize opportunities and have some Q&A time to talk about how people are adapting and what potential there is to adapt those plans. And then the 4th goal for this session is to be able to articulate the roles and responsibilities of your team members during GOTV And this is just extremely important as you're going to ask people to do different things. So that's part of your clear communication and part of what makes GOTV work. So those are our goals this morning. And I wanted to take a step back because this is the sprint at the end of the marathon, just to get us into a little bit of a GOTV mindset. So during GOTV, a lot of things happen, right? You are asking team members to take on potentially different roles than they've been doing for several months. You are potentially having different conversations with voters than you've had. You may be sending different communications than you've sent. And that's all because during GOTV, everything that you are doing is driving towards the primary goal of turning out your supporters. Whether they're hand identified or not, you are trying to turn out people who are going to vote for you. And that's the goal. So, you know, you may be like a duck on water and your legs may be furiously scrambling underneath. But just know, if you're not working towards turnout, you're doing something wrong. Now, there are lots of different ways to work towards turnout, which is what we're going to talk about in part this morning, but that's the mindset, turnout. And turnout begins as soon as voting starts. So Julia gave that terrifying date of September 4th for people starting to vote in North Carolina, Daquan and others. Let's get to work. But turnout does begin as soon as voting starts. So many people, particularly those who have worked for many cycles, tend to think about GOTV as the final 4 days of the election. Throw that out the window. That is just not the case this cycle. People who work in Arizona, people who work in Florida know that turnout begins much earlier because they have consistent, enormous parts of the population who vote by mail. The same is true for Oregon and Colorado, right? They don't run a traditional turnout program that starts with, you know, the final 4 days before the election. And you're not going to either this year. Okay, we talked about this, but as part of the mindset, roles will shift. Everyone becomes an organizer. Communication becomes more standard. And I think that's important. You know, we'll get into this, but communication becomes more standard. And we plan and train for most scenarios. Things will go wrong. You can even guess what some of the things are. And so we want to train and plan for those. When we think about GOTV at Arena, there are a couple of hallmarks that we think about to sort of adapt to the circumstances. There needs to be preparation. You're asking people to adjust what they've been doing, and that's everything from actually the what they are physically doing every day to their skills, to their location. And so it takes preparation. It also takes some training. If you're asking people to do something they haven't done before, you need to train them. That's true for staff and volunteers. And it needs alignment, right? When I do a session during our larger academies with campaign managers on why we plan, and you know, the same is true for GOTV, if not even more so, right? You need to be singing from the same songbook. Enter your own metaphor there. But people are tired. They are sometimes, you know, sitting in the same room together. Sometimes they're much more spread out than normal. And you just need alignment, because when things start to go wrong, if people don't understand the strategy, if they don't understand the goals, it's going to be that much harder for them to work towards them. So preparation, training, and alignment. I will also say, this is the time of the campaign when, if you have been ignoring things, potentially there's someone who's not pulling their weight. Potentially there's you know, a structure problem with how you have organized volunteers. You haven't gotten to a particular turf you needed to get to. There are hard things that happen on campaigns that are often easier to ignore. Now is the time to address them. If you're going into GOTV with a team that isn't solid, either staff or volunteers, with people who have sort of core issues with the campaign, now is the time to address them and reset. because you have an election to win and you want to wake up the day after the election, or in this case, potentially a few days after the election, and not have regret, right? You don't want to have, thought of something the morning after the election that you wish you had handled. You want to get your house in order so that the only thing your house is focused on is winning. Okay, so enough of that. I think you guys get the point. We're gonna dive in. So I'm gonna walk through each of these things, so don't feel like you have to be furiously writing this down. But we talked about sort of work the plan. Here are the components of a GOTV plan. There are many of them. Some of them are longer than others. I'm going to walk through them quickly here, and then we're going to start the session sort of diving into each component. So the overview, sort of very simply, where you are and where you need to be by November 3rd. The organizing plan, right? This is, who are you talking to? How are you going to, get the volunteer capacity that you need to through recruitment? What is the structure? What does reporting look like? What are the number of passes that you're going to get through, right? So your organizing plan is actually a huge piece of how you're going to answer the question that you laid out in the overview, which is where you need to be by November 3rd. I'm going to skip down to paid communications and partner activity. Those are sort of the other pieces of the pie. That's, organizing paid communications and partner activity sort of total up to how you're going to get to where you need to get by November 3rd. The timeline, which is number 3 here, are all the major deadlines and benchmarks that you have to get there. That is sort of where it all comes together, and so is often the part of the plan that's actually written best. The benchmarks, right? These are things that the Board of Elections or Secretary of State has published, right? When do ballots drop in the mail? When do they have to be returned by? These are things that benchmarks are things that you're going to set for yourself. Those are goalposts to make sure that you are getting to where you need to be with your organizing plan, with your paid communications, and with your partners to get where you need to be by November 3rd. Voter protection, obviously this year more in the spotlight than it has been in years past. It's often also the thing that gets pushed sort of to the last moment, right? I was talking about not ignoring the things that voter protection may be one of those. And this doesn't mean, finding extremely high priced lawyers to be on call 24 hours a day while people are voting by mail. But what is the structure and what is the staffing and how are you going to protect people who are either going to the polls or who have questions about their mail-in ballots? Your org chart, right? A visual representation of your team, but doing the exercise and going through the work of an org chart is extremely important to make sure you're covered. And then your budget, right? Some of these things cost money, some of them don't. You just need to figure out how much money you have to pay for the things that cost money and do some adjustment backwards. Again, we're going to spend the rest of these training diving into each of these sections, but those are the pieces that go into a GOTV plan, right? You're going to lay out your mission, where you need to be by November 3rd. You're going to talk about how you're going to get there. You're going to talk about when you're going to get there and what goals you're setting to make sure you stay on track. You're going to talk about how you can ensure that people are able to vote. You're going to make sure that you have someone assigned to do all the things, and then you're going to make sure that you can pay for it. Lots of adjustments along the way. This is not, I would say, no one sits down to write either a campaign plan or a GOTV plan and does it in like one fell swoop, right? You're going to have to get some answers to questions along the way. You're going to find out that you want to do something that you just don't have the budget for. So all of these things are going to sort of be, think about it like putting a jigsaw puzzle together. You can't do it sort of chronologically. You're going to have to move pieces around and make sure it all fits. But let's dive in. We're going to start with the who, and in this case, the who is not just one thing, it's many who's, but we're going to start with who do we actually talk to during GOTV? You have an entire session on creating your universe with the incredible Santiago Martinez. I could not possibly fill his shoes even if I tried. So this is a very cursory, who do we talk to during GOTV, a cursory look at sort of how you should think about building your universe. And the very next session that we're going to get into does a much deeper dive of that. But for that overview, who do we talk to during GOTV? Right, when you think about the sort of options out there, there's a scale of support from strong Republican to strong Democrat, right? Where in that scale do people fall? And then there's the likely to vote, right? Your turnout target. So very likely to vote to very unlikely to vote. Your job is to figure out who in that mix you want to talk to. This like extra highlighted box is where you might draw your turnout universe or your GOTV universe, right? You want to talk to people who are less likely to vote, right? You may have supporters in sort of the top right-hand corner of this grid who are strong Democrats and who are very likely to vote, and that is great because they're going to vote with or without you. You care about the people who are strong Democrats who are unlikely to vote, and then who, right, because you want to draw a pretty big grid. You want to make sure that you're scooping up everyone who needs a little extra help. That's the goal of GOTV. Your super base voters who have voted in every election since they turned 18 they've developed a really good habit and they don't need you. Newer voters, younger voters, people who it's not as easy to get to the polls, those are folks that you want to make sure you're talking to. Obviously, the more likely they are to support you, the better. So you're not trying to find strong Republicans who might have trouble voting in most cases. In most cases, you're looking for people who tend to be Democrats, who tend to support your candidate, and who need some extra help to get to the polls. You also need to talk to some other folks. You need to talk to other campaigns. You're not operating in a silo. Depending on what sort of campaign or ballot initiative you're running, you need to talk to the Democratic Party. In some states, you can actually talk to independent expenditures, and some you cannot. So please know the law before you start talking to any of them. You have other organizations, not just other campaigns, in your space that are also going to be doing turnout. And then you have out-of-state volunteers, hopefully who are directly engaged in your campaign, potentially who are not, who want to be helpful. So it's not just voters you have to talk to, though they're obviously the most important part. But there are lots of other people sort of in your ecosystem who are doing turnout. And it's important to have conversations with them so that you understand what piece of the pie you are supposed to take, right? I like saying your piece of the pie. Other people might say, so you're making sure you stay in your lane. You just want to make sure that the sort of map is covered. And so you want to have conversations with other organizations or individuals who are doing turnout in your ecosystem to make sure that there's not duplicative work unless it's intentional. Since we're sort of on the who, I want to also take a minute to talk about your campaign roles. So, your staff, depending on how big your campaign is, you may have lots of staff, you may be the only staffer, you may have one other person, and so some of this is going to be relevant, some of it's not, but your staff, right, you need to have conversations with them. They're adopting new, potentially very specific roles. They may need to learn a new communication structure. Their hours might change. And again, need training, prep, and practice for that. Your candidate also has a role in GOTV. One of the conversations we've had most frequently this year as we were getting ready for this training is, my God, what are people supposed to do with their candidates on election day? and sort of from the time that people start voting. Normally, you can send your candidate out to polling locations and to, you know, GOTV rallies and things like that. Those most likely aren't happening in the same way this year. So your candidate still needs to motivate voters and volunteers. They're the best messenger for that possible. So you want to make sure that they're doing that. But they do need a plan for election day, however long election day lasts in your state. And finally, your volunteers. This looks a little bit like the staffing box, but your volunteers also take on specific roles and responsibilities. Often, you know, you may have volunteers who, you know, run portions of the campaign. And so this isn't necessarily a heightened responsibility, but it is a more likely specific responsibility. And so having intentional conversations with them. Reporting during GOTV is sacrosanct. It's how you understand what's happening in real time. And so I would say this is true for everyone who's involved in your GOTV program, but particularly for volunteers who do so much of this. They need to understand why reporting is so important and what the structure is to do that. You're gonna, you know, I don't know how many of you have came to this work from being a volunteer. I certainly remember that. You know, you're sort of asked to report every 4 hours, like a complicated series of metrics, and volunteers often look at you and go, you know, like, so I'm 5 minutes late, what's the big deal? Or 30 minutes late, what's the big deal? I was waiting for someone to come back. They need to understand the why and why reporting on time is so important. And to do that, again, training, prep, and practice. Okay, before we move into what everyone is going to be doing, just a quick review of all of the different sort of people that are involved. So we talked about voters, though you're going to have another entire session on voters. We talked about sort of the people who exist in your ecosystem and who may be doing similar work, and so absolutely need to be talked to. And then we talked about sort of how your staff, your candidate, and your volunteers plug in at a very top line level. So those are sort of all of the people who are involved in this creation. Now we're going to talk about what all those lovely people do. So the what, right? What will you do to turn out each voter in your universe? Julia, I also can see sort of the chat blinking, but can't actually see the chat. So if there are urgent questions, will you just break in? Thank you. Okay, so right, the what. What will you do to turn out each voter in your universe? The question can actually be boiled down a little bit more simply, which is what combination of tactics will you use, right? Sometimes it's just turnout. Sometimes it's a little bit of persuasion plus turnout. Whatever type of conversations you are having and you need to have to hit your goals by November 3rd, you're going to use a different combination of tactics for different voters. And so a huge part of GOTV planning is figuring out which tactics you have available to you, right? If you don't have any budget, paid communications is off the chart, right? It costs money. You can't do it. So what free tactics are you going to use? If you have a budget, you know, your tactics expand. And so what combination of tactics are you going to use to hit every voter? We have paid tactics and we have organizing tactics, right? So paid tactics, your TV ads, your direct mail, your digital ads, in some cases radio, streaming devices, all of that. You also have your tried and true organizing tactics. You know, canvassing isn't up here because we at Arena deeply believe that you should be putting the safety of your voters and volunteers and yourself first and following public health guidance. And in most places, canvassing just isn't one of those things that flies. If you are doing canvassing, that's a choice that you've made and that's okay. But that's why it's not up here on our slide. So what are the organizing tactics available to you this cycle? Virtual events, phone banks, phone calls, one-on-one conversations, and text messaging. So your job when you're writing your GOTV plan in consultation with other members of your team, or how do you pick and choose these tactics to make sure that everyone in your universe is covered? And then what you'll need to do for GOTV. You need to build capacity, right? Regardless of the tactics that you're using, you're going to need to build capacity, whether that's volunteers, whether that's fundraising, in most cases, whether that's both. You're going to need to build capacity. You will need more people if you do things. So that's number one. Number two is you need to track progress. I just talked about this and sort of the reporting is sacrosanct, and it's really crucial that your volunteers are with you and aligned on that. But whether your Get Out the Vote program lasts for 4 days or for 4 weeks or for longer, you want to know what's happening, right? The clock is ticking down, and in a way that does not, right? Time is always a precious resource. Once voters start voting, you are actually losing the opportunity to catch people every day. And so you need to know what's happening. You need to know if more people than you thought were voting, or less people are your people the ones who are voting? So you just need to have a structure and a plan to track and report progress. You also need to understand what voters need. And you need to understand what they need to hear from your campaign that's going to help them make the decision that they need to. So as a part of tracking and reporting progress, you're going to hear from voters. And so you need to understand whether they're hearing the stuff they need to make decisions, whether they need questions answered, whether they're having trouble actually completing the task of voting. So you need to understand what they need. And then you need to actively manage and monitor. So this is a little different than tracking and reporting progress, right? That is really intended to be about voting and sort of the outcome of your conversations with voters. Actively managing and monitoring is a little bit more about voter protection, right? So are people in a particular precinct struggling? Are people being told that they can't return their ballots, their mail-in ballots in person, right? You need to sort of be engaged in the conversation around voting in your district, whether that's statewide, whether that's or a specific district. And then finally, sort of the best and worst part, you need to spend all the money. The goal at the end of the campaign is not to be sitting on a bunch of money in a bank account. Unlike regular budgets, you want to be as close to zero as you can be at the end of GOTV. So you need to understand how each dollar that you have left is going to be spent. This slide says how you'll raise late money. Hopefully that's a thing that you will get, but how you'll also spend late money. So you're going to write this whole plan based on the budget that you have, because that's the prudent thing to do. But if you think that late money is going to be a thing, or you're hoping late money is going to be a thing, take some time to understand how that money can get injected into the system and expand your capacity. I will say we have continued in 2018. This was a very, very big deal. Hopefully the trend will continue. It did in 2019. Is that late money does happen. So I wouldn't, the sort of planning for late money should not be your priority, right? The priority is to establish a comprehensive GOTV plan for the circumstances you're in right now. But you do want to spend a small portion of that time thinking about, okay, if I get late money, I don't want to be sitting on it the day after the election, right? You leave it all in the field. So what will you do with it? Okay, so those are the what's, right? What you're going to do to communicate with voters, how you're going to build capacity, what you're going to do, what systems you're going to use to track and report and actively monitor, and you're going to spend all the money. When does this all happen? great question. So the easiest way to do this is to map backwards from election day. That is not rocket science. So, we've sort of talked about the traditional final 4 days of GOTV, and in states where mail-in balloting is not going to sort of take over the cycle, and the vast majority of voters are still going to go to the polls on election day. The final 4 are really important, right? The art and science is how close to the election can you talk to people who need to vote for you. So those 4 days are really important. But we have not just sort of the traditional states who rely on mail-in ballots this year, who will be doing that. We have many, many more states. Again, North Carolina, Arizona starts voting in early October, same with Florida. So again, you want to map backwards from your election day and sort of in your state. So obviously election day is not going to change, but when do ballots drop? That's the point you want to sort of work backwards from. You'll see that we have 2 weekend of actions on this timeline. And a weekend of action meaning has potentially changed, particularly for GOTV dry runs. For those of you who have been through a GOTV before, you may have had a dry run or 2 where you go to the staging location that will be active on election day, and you sort of run a big canvas or a large phone bank out of that staging location. Again, depending on what state you are in and how they are handling and responding to COVID, you may still be thinking of a physical staging location plan. Most likely that's going to be virtual. And so the need to have staging locations is a little bit different. But whatever you decide, again, practice is really important because you're asking people to take on different roles. And in some cases, people have to report to you who have never done that. So you do want to practice. So whether it's, 1 weekend or 2 weekends, and whether they're dry runs or, something else, you want to make sure that the systems you've created while planning have a chance to be broken, quite frankly. You want to, again, not ignore any problems and not sort of cross your fingers and hope everything goes smoothly. Give people a chance to play around with it and to break it and find out what the problems are and find out what the stresses are, so that come the real thing, you guys are ready. This is an entirely overwhelming slide. I told that to Julia when I walked through the deck. I was like, this is crazy. But just to give you a sense, I can distinctly remember sitting in my very first GOTV training and getting a TikTok that looked like this and my head just like exploding. I was like, what is this? Why are there so many times on this piece of paper? But I think it's really helpful to sort of like get the heart racing and imagine yourself in this. So I left this in. The point is not to sort of walk through what a traditional Final Four schedule will look like, but just to give you a sense of, right, you've got reporting times, you've got shift times, you've got opening times, you've got closing times, and all of this should be like ingrained in your brain. And this is sort of the cadence at which GOTV runs. You have, people taking different shifts, as many as they possibly can. You have reporting times around how many people showed up, so you can calculate what your flake rate is. You have reports coming back in of how much progress those volunteers actually made, how much through the universe they got, so you can be adjusting and understanding whether something needs to change, whether you're going to sort of miss your goal or you can actually get more passes done. So reporting times, TikToks, and sharing the schedule and sharing the why are a huge part of when things happen. Okay, the how. So you have, sort of identified who the people are in your world that you need to talk to make sure that you are planning the right GOTV for your sort of campaign ecosystem. You have a sense of, your staff, you have a sense of how many volunteers you have, you understand the money that you can spend on this, you understand what tactics are available to you. You know what voters you're going to be talking or need to talk to and how many times you need to talk to them. So now we're going to get into the how. Starts with the budget, right? You can't put together a plan if you don't understand what tactics are available to you. And to understand what tactics are available to you, you have to understand your budget. So we talked about this goal of 0 or almost. Certainly there will be cases where, you know, you need to save a bit of money to cover staff expenses at the end of November, or you want to have, you know, a sort of in case of money. So in case of a recount, in case of, you know, anything on the legal side, you may want to save a little bit. But you see these stories about people who ended the campaign with like 6 figures in their bank account, or, you know, and it's a little sad because you think about what that money could have gone to, particularly if people have lost by a small margin. So, you know, the goal isn't literally 0. You want to understand what your expenses are going to be past election day as well. But you're not trying to sit there with a big buffer. So goal is 0 or almost. And here are some major line items to consider when you're thinking about your budget. So we talked a little bit about sort of the paid communications before and sort of what those components are. There are some other budget components to think about too. So there are tech and data items, whether you're going to use a predictive dialer, if you're using, you know, peer-to-peer or SMS texting, do you need to buy additional cell phone numbers? Is there any tech infrastructure that you need for staff or volunteers? You know, in the before COVID times, hotspots for staff or volunteers were like a nice thing to have when you were setting up in a church basement somewhere that didn't have good Wi-Fi. Today, right, it might be actual computers, right, additional cell phones, things like that. So what sort of technology and data items do you need to have in your budget to make your plan work? Supplies, sure, yard signs. I'll save my soapbox on yard signs for a bit later. But yes, right, yard signs, merch. You want people to be excited and to be showing their support for your candidate. So whatever that is, this is a time to make sure your volunteers are super happy. And so if someone has been asking for buttons for the entire campaign and you can afford buttons, give them a button. It's not the time to sort of fight about that. So, right, supplies to make sure your volunteers can spread the word. Printed materials, you know, do you need to print out a TikTok or you know, backup phone sheets for your staff and your volunteers? And then literature, if you're using it, right, whether you're wearing gloves and masks and handing literature out at a polling place or doing lit drops, or, you know, if you need literature, make sure that that's in your budget. Some other infrastructure pieces, right? So we talked about predictive dialer, you know, paid dialers, blast SMS texting, you know, what sort of money your staff's going to need to pull this off. So just a couple of items to think about. And I will say this list is not comprehensive, right? There are things like ponchos or hot cocoa if they're standing outside, coffee, donuts, right? Like, do you need to have supplies on hand to help keep people in line if you expect really long lines on election day at polling places? So this is not intended to be comprehensive, but some major line items to consider. Okay, so roles, reporting, structure, and org chart. This is a big part of the how, almost as big as your budget and very closely related. So this is a more sort of complicated org chart than some of you might have, and that's okay. The reason that we included it is really to show sort of how this breaks down. So in this org chart, you have a campaign manager, you have an organizing director, and then you have, you can see you have various regional organizing directors and organizers and staging location directors under those. And that's great. That's a, you know, a fairly healthy sized campaign. You may not have that. You may actually have something that looks a little bit more like this, which is a campaign manager. You know, maybe you have a rapid response lead, maybe you have a voter protection lead, maybe you don't. But at your heart, maybe you've got an organizing director and a field director, a field desk, and that's okay. You know, you may just have an organizer and volunteers who fill these positions, and that's okay too. Really, you know, and I know this as HQ Virtual Boiler Room, we're just going to use it as an example. Really, what you want to think about is who's over what. So whatever staff or volunteer assets you have, these are sort of the core components of a GOTV program. And so you need to make sure that you have, you know, if you are running a strong voter protection program, how does that work its way up? Like, what does that structure look like? If you have someone, you know, either a data person on staff or a volunteer who's very good with data, you know, can they be helpful in helping you process all of the reporting that's coming up from the field desk, from the organizing director? This is something that we put together. This is a field virtual boiler room. So take your old staging location and turn it online. So you've got in this one, and this again could be staff or volunteers, you've got sort of the field desk in this teal color, which serves as the central point of collecting information. And then you've got regional field desks, your field organizers, and your staging location directors. So what I think is great about this is that you still have lots of access points. So you're not sort of making all of your volunteers report just up to one person. This still gives you the option of having sort of virtual staging locations and having, you know, for those who've been running virtual phone banks, a virtual staging location and a staging location director could still host virtual phone banks, but also is sending their information up to a, you know, a regional field desk who's sending it back to HQ for, you know, it's all done by Zoom or Google Hangouts, but still the information is being, there are enough people to collect the information sort of from the spread out levels, and then it's still brought up in a streamlined way to the people who need it, who are sort of seeing the global picture and who can help make resource allocation decisions. There's also just like the breakdown of like a virtual staging location. You know, staging locations in real life tend to be big hubs of activity where lots of things, you know, people are coming in and out and they're taking canvas packets and they're, you know, dropping off their data. You've got some people on the phone, you've got a comfort captain, right? All sorts of activities happen in one location. Virtual staging locations obviously would be a bit different, but I think the idea of the sort of idea that you want to replicate is twofold. One, that hum of activity is really motivational. And so having a way to try to recapture that, the sort of coming and going and volunteers understanding that they're not just sitting in their house by themselves, sort of doing this hard work, but having a centralized place where volunteers can check in, certainly where they can exchange the results of their work, but also just a chance to like see other people and have some interaction is just critical. So it's not going to be sort of the same practical, you know, we need to have an extra present X part of the community, and so we're going to put a staging location here and drive more volunteers physically to that location so that they're closer to that turf. Right, you're doing this online, you don't have to be anywhere, but you can replicate some of the motivational aspects of it and some of the data streamlining aspects of it, and those two parts are really important. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking at you for a brief moment. I'm also gonna stop sharing my screen. Um, because I want you guys, I think the adaptation to COVID is real. And so you all are out in the field, you guys are having, you know, sort of adaptation conversations in real time every day. And so I want to just take a few minutes, we've actually got 7, to have you all partner up and talk about what unique roles and unique structures you all either have created already and can share as best practice, or what you're struggling with and your partner may have good insight into. And I wanted to, as we get started here, hop back in just to put this slide up again. I know we talked about a lot of different things, and there were some additional slides here, but I actually thought it would be maybe most helpful not to sort of do a few extra slides, but save the time for Q&A. So I will just sort of do a quick run through of the things that we talked about and of these categories. And then happy to take questions. We'll see how many questions there are. And if there aren't that many, we have a partner debrief exercise planned, and we'll get to that. So just a quick debrief of the things that we talked about. We talked a bit about your organizing plan, a little bit about sort of what the components of this look like. A reminder that the very next session is all about determining your universe. So saw some questions about how persuasion and turnout universes might overlap in the chat. Those are great questions, and next session is a perfect time to ask those and go much more in depth on them. But really want to emphasize the structure and reporting aspect of the organizing plan, which again are just the means to help you make quick resource allocation decisions, which is what GOTV is about. And sort of how far back you should actually be planning to allow for good practice in the plan as well. Paid communications, but we didn't talk very much about this other than the tactics that are involved, but happy to answer any questions about that. Partner activity, again, just hugely important to have those conversations. I think the example that Quan just pointed out about Lauren Underwood and local campaigns that are running in overlapping districts is a great one, right? People are out there operating in your space, and so understanding what they are doing and how it might fit into your work is just extremely important. And in some cases, like the Lauren Underwood folks, you might get something out of it, which are extra IDs, which is great. We talked a little bit about structure and sort of the COVID realities of what an org chart might look like today versus what it looked like even in 2019. But happy to answer questions about that as well. And then the budget, right, again, the point is to spend to as close to zero as you can. And you know, doing that through a variety of budget considerations, but happy to answer questions there as well.